We're talking about legacies and power this week. We tend to think about inheritance as financial wealth that's passed from generation to generation. That kind of inheritance is important. It's very important. The other day, I went to dinner with a couple of friends of mine. One of them, actually the youngest among us by far, works in IT. And he makes more income than he ever intends on spending or is interested in spending. And he comes from a family that will one day pass wealth down to him. This is all a little awkward for someone that has strong socialist leanings and is disturbed by the wealth gap that's growing in America. So last week over dinner, he told us about the organization he was joining. It's called Resource Generation. Their website says Resource Generation is a multiracial membership community of young people, that's 18 to 35, with wealth and/or class privilege, committing to the equitable distribution of wealth, land, and power. I love this idea. As you may remember, a couple of weeks ago, talking about power, I mentioned money. It's not something to be afraid of. It's not inherently evil. Money is just one of the powers that some of us have and need to think about how we use. So my friend, and it sounds like a bunch of other young people, are thinking carefully about how they will go beyond giving a little bit away. They aim to use their money to push our very lopsided economy toward equitable distribution of wealth, power, and land. The commitment they seek from members is to give away 7% of their wealth every year. According to their calculations, that's the amount necessary to move beyond the loop of wealth generating more wealth. The tagline says, as wealthy young people, we're saying wealth inequality ends with our generation. I was intrigued. I guess there are a lot more ways of thinking of financial inheritance than I realized. It's a pretty huge topic. Today, though, I want us to focus less on material resources that we inherit. Beyond money, an array of attitudes and behaviors is passed down to us. We inherit family cultures that bring meaning and power into our lives. Now, those of you who have taken a look at systemic racism and where you fit into the landscape of various oppressions, you've probably explored the idea of white privilege. White privilege is an assortment of different advantages that white people are given sheerly by virtue of the color of their skin. These advantages are often difficult to recognize by people who have them because they appear to be simply the normal way of living in the world. There are, of course, other types of unearned privilege like gender and sexual orientation and physical ability. I think it's important today, though, to briefly mention race privilege because it's one that's passed down generation to generation. That we're working hard to dismantle it. Systemic racism is a present reality. It's entwined with how we inherit power or how we don't. Connected with our racial or ethnic group, there are particular cultural norms, right? Again, it's sometimes difficult for people to recognize those norms because it just seems like what people do. But in the end, each of us inherits a particular culture from our family, the way things are done. And for each of those, there are inherent strengths. When we take some of those to the extreme without a counterbalance, there can be a shadow side, though. A lot of us come from families with a particular emphasis on achievement, and that can bear great fruit in personal economic gain and contributing to the wider world. But that culture of achievement also comes with a shadow side of perfectionism sometimes, or individualism, or judging others based solely on their achievements. A lot of us inherit a culture that focuses on individual achievement. Others here inherit a culture that focuses on shared interest and family or community. That type of communal understanding of the world is beautiful and inspiring. Without balance, though, there's a shadow side. That focus on family ties and community can silence the individual. Communal cultures can shame difference for the sake of group conformity. I couldn't talk about inheritance and power without acknowledging race. Inequity is an ever present reality that shapes our world. Still, in the midst of all of that wider picture, we find meaning and strength in our own family stories and backgrounds. The legacies that we inherit aren't only defined by systemic oppression and systemic violence. We also inherit an array of different mental and emotional and spiritual resources from our family. In our reading today, we heard one woman's recognition of her cultural inheritance from her father. As the daughter of a poor immigrant, the author learned a great deal from her father. Even though as a young person, she dismissed his wisdom, as an adult, she appreciated the gifts she inherits from him. That sounds familiar, perhaps, to some of us. She says, you can grow up being poor, raise children being poor, and love them immensely and well in the process. She learned that your vulnerability is your grace. And you don't have to be powerful to have a powerful story. What a beautiful inheritance of wisdom. That's not the wisdom that was passed down to me. My wisdom story is a little bit different. In the simplest form, we can think of these as lessons, but as I described a couple of weeks ago, we are social creatures. Our understanding of the world and of ourselves is shaped by our environment. We don't just learn lessons from our families. Most of us, in fact, resisted those lessons from our parents for a very long time, or at least I know I did. But in the end, in most cases, our families made us who we are. One of the scariest quotes I've ever heard about parenting comes from Robert Fulghum. He writes, "Don't worry that your children haven't heard what you've told them. Worry that they've seen how you lived your life." So this morning we ask, what is it that you heard your elders say? Or perhaps more importantly, how did you see them live their lives that handed resources to you? One of the gifts I received from my family was a culture of outdoor adventure. Like most inherited cultural gifts, I didn't recognize this as a particular orientation of my family. I thought it was what everyone did. Our family vacations were almost always outdoors. My first backpacking trip, I think, was around the age of 9, and we went every year after that. I think the last family trip that I took backpacking was just me and my mom backpacking in Wyoming. Also, following in my parents' footsteps, I got certified for scuba at the age of 16 or 17. And for a few years in the early 2000s, I went with my parents on a week-long bicycle trek across the state of Oklahoma. We rode mostly back roads from Kansas to Texas over the week. For the longest time, I just thought this was the thing that normal people did. I now realize how lucky I was to have had these adventures baked into my mental framework. Along with that sense of adventure came an unavoidable appreciation for nature. With that much exposure to natural beauty, you can't help but come to love it and to crave more open space. Another way to ask this question of cultural inheritance may be to ask, who are the heroes of your family story and what makes those heroes so special? It's a good window into any culture, really. In the United States, we have the folk heroes of Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and Thomas Jefferson and Susan B. Anthony. Look at why heroes are celebrated by a group of people, and you have a pretty good idea of what those people value. It works with families too. I know on my dad's side of the family, there was always a lot of talk about Papa Hera. I believe he was my dad's grandfather on his mother's side. He might even have been my dad's great grandfather. I never met him, and I obviously don't know very much about him. What I do know was that he went to Cornell and was quite the gentleman. All these generations later, what I know about him was that he went to an Ivy League school. It was obviously a source of pride in that line of the family. And education became a big part of that family culture. I don't know much about my grandparents' educational pursuits. I do know that following in that line, my own dad worked really hard to pay his way through college. With no financial support from parents, he flipped burgers and worked campus jobs. In college, he rode a little motorbike, the kind with pedals that needed extra power to get up the hills. And they continued to live a pretty lean life until he graduated from graduate school. These are strange details of my family to know and to share. They're also strange details for me to remember generations later. This isn't something that I've thought a whole lot about, but it happens to shape my family culture, I guess, if it's what I remember. Through my dad's side of the family, education has been a huge priority, even when it's really expensive or really difficult to attain. On the way here this morning in the car, I realized I also needed to mention our deep family awareness of both grandfathers serving in World War II. Both were severely wounded. One was taken as a prisoner of war in the Pacific. His body and his heart never fully recovered from that experience. The lessons, the cultural inheritance from their experience isn't so crystal clear. More than anything, as I thought about it this week, our family became aware of the profound human cost of war. Having read the stories of one of my grandfathers that he wrote to his own mother during the war, including the opening sentence of one of them, "Don't worry, Mom, I've been shot, but I'm doing okay." Having heard some of the horrors of the prisoner of war camp. Those stories of heroes get baked into who we are and how we understand the world, and they have gifts among them. So all this rambling begs the question, who were the heroes of your family? What are the names that stand out generations later for some attribute? Another more difficult question might be, who are the villains of your family? Just as much as cultures reflect on heroes, villains also help us understand what cultures value. Many of you have participated in small group ministries here at Tapestry. There are discussion groups. They tend to chew on the particular theme of the week or of the month, I'm sorry, as we've explored monthly themes of compassion, courage, forgiveness, justice, and so on. The discussion questions often emerge. What did you learn from your family about compassion? What did you learn from your family about courage? What did you learn from your family about forgiveness or justice? What resources for strength did they give you? What have you learned from your family of origin that gives you some power and meaning in this life? Amen.